A single fossil jawbone found in the Egyptian desert is now the strongest physical evidence that the ancestors of every living ape, gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans, may have originated in North Africa rather than East Africa. The region scientists have centered ape evolution research on for nearly a century. Researchers from Mansoura University in Egypt and the University of Southern California have named the animal Masripithecus moghraensis and dated it to between 17 and 18 million years old. During the early Miocene epoch, it was unearthed at the Wadi Moghra fossil site in northern Egypt. For decades, virtually every major ape ancestor fossil that mattered came out of Kenya, Uganda, and other East African sites, which is why textbooks and museum exhibits almost universally frame East Africa as the cradle of ape evolution. This single jawbone does not erase that record, but its anatomy places it closer to living apes than any East African fossil from the same time window. And that detail is enough to make paleontologists reconsider where the story actually starts. Let us sort the signal from the noise. The East Africa-centered story of ape evolution was never built on a deliberate decision that a region was special. It was built on where fossils happened to survive and where paleontologists happened to dig. The Great Rift Valley, running through Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, creates unusually favorable conditions for fossil preservation. Active geology repeatedly buried and exposed sediment layers over millions of years. And it has also been the site of sustained, well-funded paleontological research since the early 20th century. Landmark early ape fossils, including species like Proconsul, came from exactly this region. And each new find reinforced the same research pattern. More expeditions went to East Africa because that is where discoveries kept happening. And discoveries kept happening there partly because that is where expeditions kept going. North Africa, including Egypt, was comparatively underexplored for this specific window of ape evolution. Not because researchers had good reason to think apes were not there, but because attention, funding, and fossil hunting infrastructure had already concentrated a few thousand kilometers to the south and east. Masripithecus moghraensis is not just old. Its specific anatomy is what makes paleontologists take notice. Researchers analyzed the shape and structural details of the jaw and teeth and found it shares more derived features, meaning more evolutionarily advanced traits shared with living apes, than any known East African fossil ape from the same 17 to 18 million year window. In plain terms, if you lined up every ape fossil from that era by how closely their anatomy resembles a modern gibbon or gorillas, this specimen from Egypt would sit closer to modern apes than its East African contemporaries do. That is a meaningful technical claim. Not just a matter of the fossil being found somewhere unexpected. It suggests that whatever evolutionary changes eventually led toward living apes may have already been underway in populations living in what is now Egypt, at the same time or even ahead of populations living further south, and East Wadi Moghra itself was a very different environment 18 million years ago. A wetter, more forested landscape than today's desert, capable of supporting the kind of primate community this fossil implies once lived there. The significance here goes beyond relocating a single species on a map. Geographically, northern Egypt and the wider Middle East sit at a natural crossroads between Africa, Europe, and Asia. The kind of connective region where researchers have long suspected ancient animal populations moved back and forth as climate and sea levels shifted over millions of years. If ape ancestors were established in this corridor 17 to 18 million years ago, It opens a plausible pathway for early ape lineages to have dispersed in multiple directions from a northern starting point, rather than radiating outward from a single East African origin point the way most existing textbook diagrams show. Researchers are careful to frame this as a genuine open question rather than a settled replacement theory. One important fossil shifts probability. It does not by itself prove Egypt was definitively the origin point over East Africa. But it is exactly the kind of find that reopens a question the field had treated as largely answered. And that reopening is itself scientifically valuable, regardless of which region eventually gets confirmed as the true starting point. Here is the limit on how far to take this. This conclusion rests on a single fossil jawbone, one specimen from one site, interpreted through comparative anatomy rather than genetic evidence, which simply does not exist for something this old. Fossil DNA does not survive 17 million years in most conditions. So every claim here comes from reading bone and tooth shape, a well-established method in paleontology, but one that leaves real room for disagreement among experts who study the same specimen. Overturning nearly a century of East Africa-centered research on the strength of one jawbone is a genuinely large claim, and the wider paleontology community has not yet had time to independently scrutinize, replicate, or challenge this interpretation the way any major finding eventually gets tested. It is entirely possible that future digs in East Africa turn up an equally older fossil with similarly advanced features, which would undercut the exclusivity of this claim without erasing the value of the Egyptian find itself. Treat this as a strong, well-argued new data point that has reopened a real scientific question, not as a settled rewrite of the ape family tree just yet. Quick recap. A 17 to 18 million year old fossil jawbone found at Egypt's Wadi Moghra site, named Masripithecus moghraensis, shows anatomical features closer to living apes than any East African fossil from the same era, challenging the long-standing assumption that East Africa alone was the birthplace of the ape lineage. So, signal or noise? Leaning signal, with real caveats attached. This is a rigorously analyzed, technically specific finding, not a vague headline stretching a minor discovery. And it comes from a legitimate research team with a clear, falsifiable anatomical claim. But it rests on one specimen, interpreted without genetic evidence, and has not yet run the gauntlet of independent scrutiny every major paleontology claim eventually faces. The honest version of this story is not that scientists proved apes came from Egypt. It is that scientists found real evidence that reopens a question the field had treated as settled. And now more digging, literal and scientific, needs to happen before anyone rewrites the textbook. Subscribe for the discoveries that are actually rewriting history, not just claiming to signal from the noise. Every week.